Part 6. The Way to Learn Again. It was in early autumn when I worked at the bus service station. My mother called me when she saw a wallpaper on the street. She told me to go to a night school. My mother was a resident, so she didn't tell me anything, but she always seemed to think of me. I went to a night school called a self-support school because my mother's strong determination to have me study. It wasn't a regular school. It was a night middle school that an adult who served as head of a school made at his own expense for the underprivileged. The school was in the field of Dongyodong, Seoul. Volunteer college students came to teach at the school where the walls were built with blocks and roofed with slates. Inside the school building, there were only 2 classrooms and an office room. The principal came to the class every week and spoke to the students with a solemn look. Even if your environment is difficult, please don't be daunted and study hard. It may be difficult now, but if you study hard, you will lead our country in the future. I want you to be a person who has a good influence on others. Everyone was so busy that they couldn't afford to look around. It was hard to believe that some of them were trying to open the way to learning for poor youths to learn. Most of the students were older than me. At that time, there were a lot of people who couldn't go to middle school. Even though it was difficult to raise money for the tuition, the entrance exam to middle school was always a war because of the lack of school facilities. Many of my friends who couldn't go to school went to the factory or store like me. Some of my friends swarmed around the neighborhood alley. Many young people despised their friends who couldn't go to the school, calling them factory boy or factory girl. I resented a society where the poor couldn't live properly and were treated with contempt because of lack of money. The students of the night school were teenagers who lived faithfully in their own way. One of the students were selling sweet potato fries, and another one of them were cleaning shoes. A friend of mine was the same age as I was, so we got along very well. He was worse off than I was. A tent house was his family house, leaning on a retaining wall in a quiet place. His father worked on loaning comic books, but he had a bright face and voice. Though poor, he looked harmonious. Since then, I worked in the workshop during the day, went to school at 6 p.m., and slept in the house. My father moved the sewing machine from the workshop to home, and he decided to lock it empty at night. I was satisfied with being able to sleep at home. I was able to sleep well because I didn't hear the cries of the dogs that cried painfully every night. I was happy to be able to study. I won second place on the first test, beating the older students. Most of them were students who worked during the day and studied at night, so it was not difficult to be in first place. But I felt like I had the whole world, and I was full of confidence. School classes started at 7 p.m. On the way to school, I often bought sandwiches on the side of the road for dinner. The middle of the toast was filled with fried eggs, and the smell of butter hovered at the tip of my nose. One day, I was eating toast, and the shopkeeper asked me where I was going in the evening. Almost every day I stopped by the shop at the same time, and he wondered where I was going. I answered in a timid voice that I was going to school. It was because I didn't have to call it a school. The boy student, standing next to me, suddenly smiled and said, Where is the school? Why are you going at this time? The moment I heard that, I got choked up. My nose became cold as if I were crying, and I wanted to hide somewhere. I glared at the student. He wore a black school uniform and a black school cap. The boy was turning his head and munching on toast, as if to ignore me. Did he know what he said casually had crushed my pride? One day, after going to the night school for about 3 months, my mother suddenly asked me to take the entrance exam for middle school. My mother seemed worried about her son's future and thought she should have him study. I only dreamed of reapplying to a regular school, and I didn't know what was what. I rushed to apply for admission to S Middle School a few days before the application deadline. My mother told me to study instead of going to the workshop. It was a good thing. On the other hand, my father seemed to want me to learn skills and help him rather than go to school. My father must have had a hard time making a living with my family by himself. There was only a week left before the exam. It was a middle school entrance exam where others had failed even if they prepared for it for a year. Fortunately, last year's textbook was still at home. I skimmed through all the subjects, including art and music. At that time, there was a physical training test. The physical training test had 1 to 4 points in 4 categories: 100-meter running, chin-up, ball throwing, and broad jumping. But I couldn't do any chin-ups and throw well. As a result of that exam, I failed. At that time, S Middle School was a good public school. I wasn't confident in passing the second exam. Then, I spent a few days thoughtlessly planning to go back to the night school. My mother asked me to apply for the second exam again. She said that she saw the notice of additional entrance exams in front of the main gate of K Middle School. The school was going to recruit additional students for the evening class. I was lucky enough to pass the second exam. Finally, I went to middle school a year late, but since I entered elementary school a year early, it didn't matter at all. I didn't have any more worries because my parents could afford to pay the tuition for middle school. It was a lucky thing that my mother never gave up on me entering school.